Montana Territory, October 17th, 1885. The first hard snow of the season came down on Catherine Morrison's shoulders while she worked the shovel with hands that had forgotten how to feel cold. She dug alone on the ridge above Elkhorn Creek, where the cottonwoods grew thick along the water, each thrust of the blade into frozen earth a small violence against the numbness spreading through her chest. Her daughter stood nearby the whole time. Lily was 5 years old, grave as a magistrate, presiding over a court whose verdict had already been rendered. She held the doll her father had carved from a scrap of pine the previous Christmas, and she did not cry. She watched her mother dig, and her face went very still in the way that small faces go still when they understand something has left and is not coming back, even if they cannot yet name what that something is. 3 days earlier, Thomas Morrison had been crushed beneath a cedar log at Henshaw's lumber mill. The foreman told Catherine it happened instantly when the conveyor belt seized and the load slid backward without warning. He stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "Thomas did not suffer," said it 3 times as though repetition could soften what had happened. Catherine understood what he was trying to say. She also understood what he was not saying, which was that Thomas had been rushing because they were short-handed that morning, and he had been short-handed because Catherine had asked him to come home early that evening. He had agreed because they had quarreled the night before about buying extra blankets for the winter, and he wanted to make peace. The last words she had said to her husband before he walked out to the door that morning were these: "You never listened to me, Thomas. You never have." And then the cedar log fell, and he was gone. And the words stayed. They stayed in the air of the cabin like smoke that would not clear. They stayed in her throat when she tried to pray. They stayed in the small spaces of her life where she used to keep the ordinary comforts of a marriage. And now there was only this one sentence repeating itself in her mind like a clock she could not stop. The shovel struck rock. Catherine knelt in the snow and cleared the stone with her bare hands. Her knuckles scraped raw, and she did not stop until the hole was deep enough. Lily helped her lower the pine box they had built together in the cabin, the child's small hands gripping one corner with a concentration that made Catherine's heart crack open in a way the crying had not. They filled the grave in silence. When it was done, Catherine drove a wooden cross into the earth at the head of the mound, and Lily placed her doll at its base as though leaving a sentinel to keep watch. They walked back to the cabin through snow that was already erasing their tracks. Catherine carried her daughter partway when Lily's legs grew tired, the child's weight slight against her hip, and she thought about the arithmetic of survival. One woman, 26 years old, one child, 5. A winter coming that had announced itself 3 weeks early, with geese fleeing south in ragged formations and a creek pulling back into itself like a hand closing into a fist. Catherine Morrison came from Vermont, originally from a small town in the Green Mountains, where her mother Ruth had been the only midwife within a day's ride. Ruth Whitman was the kind of woman who read the weather 2 days out by the color of the sky, who knew which roots in the forest floor were medicine and which were poison, who understood that the land keeps records, no one writes down, but that anyone can read if they are willing to kneel. Her mother had a saying she repeated so often that Catherine stopped hearing it the way children stop hearing anything said too many times: "The land talks to anyone willing to listen." But the words went into her anyway, the way water goes into stone slowly and without permission, and they became part of the shape of her. When Catherine was 16, she fell in love with a young lumberman named Thomas Morrison, who had come east to buy horses for his father's operation in Montana. He was tall and quiet and had the kind of hands that looked like they could build anything. Catherine told her mother she was going to marry him and move west. Ruth said no. They fought for 3 days. Her mother said the Montana Territory was no place for a 16-year-old girl. She said Thomas was too restless, that he had the look of a man who would not listen when his wife saw something he did not see. She said Catherine was too young to understand the difference between love and the wish to escape a small town where everyone knew her. Catherine said terrible things back. She said her mother was jealous because her own husband had died when Catherine was 9, and she had never loved again. She said Ruth was a bitter woman who wanted her daughter to be bitter too. She said things she did not mean and could not take back, and then she packed her small trunk and left with Thomas without her mother's blessing. 3 years later, word came that Ruth had died of pneumonia in February. Catherine was 19. She had not written home in 18 months. There was no funeral she could reach in time, no goodbye she could offer, no last apology she could deliver. Her mother had been buried in the snow of the Vermont hills, while Catherine was 500 miles away feeding chickens in a valley her mother had never seen. And there was a letter, a single letter that came with word of Ruth's death written in her mother's careful hand, sealed and unopened. Catherine held that letter for 7 years. She kept it in a small wooden box under her bed, and every time she thought about opening it, she felt the weight of everything she had said in their last argument, and she could not do it. She was afraid of what her mother might have written. She was more afraid that her mother had written nothing important at all, that the letter might be a grocery list or a notation about the weather, and that this would prove somehow that her mother had stopped caring before she died. So the letter sat, and Catherine told no one about it, not even Thomas. She carried her mother's death the way you carry a stone sewn into the hem of your dress, where it drags at every step and no one else can see it. There was one other thing she had not told Thomas. In the spring of 1881, she had lost a child 4 months along. One morning the pain started, and by that evening the baby was gone. She had bled for 2 weeks afterward, lying in their one-room cabin, while Thomas brought her broth and did not know what to say. He had known about the pregnancy. He had not known that she blamed herself for losing it because she had been lifting a heavy water barrel the day before against his advice, and she had told him she was fine, and she had not listened when he asked her to rest. She did not tell him about the guilt. She carried that too, in the same place she carried the letter, in the same place she carried her mother's last words. Now Thomas was gone, and she was 26, and she had a 5-year-old daughter to keep alive through a winter that was already arriving 3 weeks early. On the morning of November 4th, 1885, Catherine sat down at her kitchen table and did something Thomas would never have done. She counted. She counted every stick of firewood stacked against the cabin wall, running her hand over each piece, her lips moving silently with the tally. 247 pieces. She estimated the rate the fireplace consumed wood on the coldest nights based on 2 winters of careful observation, the kind of observation Thomas had called worrying too much. On the coldest nights, the fire ate through 18 to 20 pieces between sunset and dawn. She calculated forward with the stub of a pencil on a scrap of paper, the numbers small and precise. If the winter was ordinary, the wood would last until mid-February. But this was not going to be an ordinary winter. She felt that in the way her mother had taught her to feel things. The geese had left a full month ahead of schedule, their formations breaking apart in the sky like a warning, written in a language only some people could read. The creek was already running thin, pulling back into itself the way water does when it knows what is coming. The wind had shifted 3 weeks early, coming down from the north with a bite that tasted of iron and distance. If winter came early and stayed late, the wood would run out around January 12th. That date settled into her mind and would not leave. January 12th, and then 2 more months of cold deep enough to kill. 2 more months of nights in a cabin where the fire had gone out. 2 more months with a 5-year-old child sleeping beside her. Catherine set down the pencil and looked at her daughter. Lily sat on the floor near the hearth, arranging small stones in a pattern only she understood. And the sight of her doing something so ordinary made Catherine's throat close. She thought about what it would mean to watch that small body go still from cold, to wake one morning and find her daughter's lips blue and her skin ice. The thought was not abstract. It was specific and immediate, a future she could see with terrible clarity, and it lived in her chest like a second heart beating alongside her own. Then she remembered the cave. The previous July, she had gone up the draw behind their claim to pick cranberries in the damp places near the rocks. Lily had been with her, small and serious, carrying her own tin bucket. They had wandered farther than Catherine intended, following the line of a small, warm wind that seemed to come from nowhere. And they had found a cave tucked into the hillside like a crease in a weathered face. Catherine had stepped inside. The air had been mild, even on that hot summer day, mild in a way that felt wrong, mild in a way that it suggested the cave was doing something that caves should not do. And from somewhere deeper inside, she had heard water moving, not a trickle, but a real flow with a sound like a quiet conversation in another room. She had gone home that evening and told Thomas about it. She had said the cave was warm in a way she could not explain, and that she thought it was worth exploring before the first frost. Thomas had smiled at her with the half-attentive smile of a man whose mind was already on tomorrow's work, and he had said, "Bears probably. There's bears hibernating in every hole in these hills." And he had not gone to look, and Catherine had filed the information away in the place where she kept all the things the land had told her that no one else wanted to hear. Now sitting at her kitchen table with the arithmetic of January laid out in front of her, she thought about that cave. She thought about the warmth. She thought about the water. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire and held Lily close against her side and felt her daughter's small breath rising and falling, and she thought about what it would mean to stay and what it would mean to go. The staying was certain death written in numbers on a scrap of paper. The going was the kind of decision that would make every soul in the valley call her mad. Before dawn, she went to the wooden box under her bed. For the first time in 7 years, she took out her mother's letter. Her hand shook. She sat by the fire and broke the wax seal that her mother had pressed with her own thumb, and she unfolded the single sheet of paper. The handwriting was her mother's, each letter formed with the careful precision Ruth brought to everything she did. The words were few. "My dear Catherine, the land does not lie. Only people lie. When you lose your way, kneel down. I love you. I always did. Mama." That was all. 34 words. Nothing about forgiveness. Nothing about reproach. Nothing about the 3 years of silence or the terrible things Catherine had said in their last argument. Only this: the land does not lie. Only people lie. When you lose your way, kneel down. I love you. I always did. Catherine put the letter down on her lap, and for the first time in the 7 years since her mother's death, and for the first time in the 3 weeks since Thomas's, she wept. Not the stiff, contained weeping she had done at the funerals. A breaking kind of weeping, the kind that comes up from a place below. Thought the kind that does not ask permission. She wept for her mother and for Thomas and for the baby she had lost in 1881. And she wept for the small stone girl who had stood beside her at the graveside, and she wept until there was nothing left. Then she folded the letter and put it inside the pocket of her dress against her ribs, where it would stay for the rest of her life. She stood up. She wiped her face. She began to pack. Word spread fast in a place where people had nothing to do but talk about each other. Henry Ashford heard it first from a trapper passing through who had stopped at Catherine's claim and found her loading a handcart with blankets and tins of preserved food. Henry was 66 years old. He had been a hunter in those hills for 40 years and a widower or something like one for far longer than that. He had the deep stillness of men who have lived alone so long that stillness becomes a kind of language. He rode to Catherine's cabin the next morning with his hat already in his hands before he dismounted, because he had come to say something he did not want to say, and politeness required him to say it properly. He found Catherine in the yard sorting supplies. Lily sat on the porch step with her doll, watching with the grave attention of a child who has decided that whatever is happening is important and therefore requires her full concentration. Henry spoke carefully. He told Catherine this was no way for a woman with a child to spend a winter. He told her about a family he had known, the Pickett family, who had tried to winter in a cave 8 years back. Not a warm cave, just a hole in the rock that they thought would keep the wind off. The youngest child had fallen from a ledge in the dark. Henry told the story without embellishment because he believed it was true and relevant, and because he was genuinely frightened for the small, serious girl on the porch. Catherine listened to every word. She thanked him and she continued loading the cart. Henry stood there a moment longer. He looked at the cart and the blankets rolled tight and the jars of beans and the child on the step, and something moved across his face that he did not expect to feel. "My sister was stubborn like you," he said quietly. "She didn't listen either." And then he put his hat back on and rode away. And Catherine watched him go, and she understood that she had just heard something that had been locked away for a very long time. She did not ask. There are doors you do not open in other people's houses. But after he was gone, she sat down on the cold ground beside her packed cart, and she let herself tremble for 5 minutes. That was all she gave herself. 5 minutes to shake, 5 minutes to let every terrible possibility move through her mind without trying to stop any of them. The cold finding its way in, the child getting sick, a rock fall, an animal, a mistake that would cost everything because there was no one to catch it. Then she stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the next bundle, and strapped it to the cart. Margaret Walsh heard the news that same afternoon. Margaret was 55 years old, and she owned the only general store in Dawson's Creek, which was the nearest settlement 2 hours by horse on good roads. She ran her store with the rigid certainty of a woman who believed she understood how the world worked and how it did not. 10 years earlier, Margaret's only child, a daughter named Henrietta, had died of pneumonia at the age of 12 during a winter as cold as the one now arriving. Margaret had never spoken of Henrietta to anyone in Dawson's Creek. The grief had gone into her the way a nail goes into wood all at once and straight down, and it had not come out. It had turned instead into something that looked like concern for other people's children, but was actually the same grief wearing a different dress. When she heard about Catherine Morrison, the widow who was taking her child into a cave, Margaret sat down at her counter and wrote a letter. She used the words neglect and unfit conditions. She said the child should be removed from the mother's care for the child's own safety. She addressed the letter to Reverend Isaiah Stone, the circuit preacher who served the scattered settlements across 100 miles of territory. She sealed it and gave it to the next rider heading east, and she felt satisfied that she had done the right thing. She did not tell herself one other thing. Her brother Clayton Walsh, 50 years old and a drunkard, had been looking for a claim. Catherine's land, if the widow were declared unfit, would go at auction at a good price. Margaret did not think about this part of it much. She thought about Henrietta dying in the cold. She thought about the other child, the one she could still save, and she told herself that was the only reason. This is how evil usually works. It wears the face of love. It believes its own sermons. The worst things people do to each other are often done by people who are very sure they are helping. Catherine did not know about the letter. She packed her cart. She took one last look at the cabin where she had lived for 4 years, at the bed where her husband had slept at the hearth, where her child had taken her first steps. And then she took Lily's small hand in hers, and she began the walk up the draw toward the cave, the wind already hard against her back, the first small flakes of a new snow beginning to fall. They had gone perhaps 3/4 of a mile up the path when Catherine stopped. Something was wrong. She could not say what it was at first. She stood still on the trail, and Lily stood still beside her, and she looked at the rocks ahead, and she looked at the sky, and then she saw it. Thin smoke was rising from the mouth of the cave. Someone was already there. Her heart dropped. She thought first of wolves and then of men, a trapper perhaps, a drifter, someone she did not want to meet while she was alone with a 5-year-old child and a cart full of everything they owned. She crouched down beside Lily and spoke very quietly. "I need you to stay behind this rock. Don't make a sound. I'll come back for you." Lily nodded. She sat down behind the rock and held her doll, and her eyes went very wide, but she did not cry. Catherine walked the last 100 yards with her hand on the small knife she carried at her belt, the only weapon she owned. She reached the mouth of the cave. She stopped. She listened. She could hear voices inside. A woman's voice, a child's voice, an old man's voice cracked with coughing. She stepped forward into the entrance, her hand still on the knife. 4 faces turned towards her. A woman about 40 years old, tall and gaunt with graying hair pulled back. A boy of perhaps 16 who raised a rifle toward her the moment she appeared. A girl of maybe 9 with long dark hair who was holding a wooden knife carved from a piece of kindling. And an old man, very old, wrapped in a blanket near a small fire coughing. Catherine raised her hands. "I mean no harm. I have a child. We came here for shelter." The boy did not lower the rifle. His hands were shaking. The woman stood up slowly. She was very thin. Her face had the hollowed look of someone who had been through something terrible and had not yet stopped going through it. Daniel put it down. The boy did not move. Put it down, she said again more softly. He lowered the rifle slowly. The woman stepped forward. She looked at Catherine's face and then passed her toward the mouth of the cave. You said you have a child. A daughter, 5 years old. She's behind the rock. Get her, it's too cold out there. Catherine turned and walked back down the path, and she called Lily's name, and Lily came out from behind the rock, and Catherine picked her up and carried her the rest of the way to the cave. And when they came inside, the girl with the wooden knife set it down on the stone floor without a word. Her name was Sarah Brennan. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in a steamboat collision on the Missouri River. She had been living with her 16-year-old son, Daniel, her 9-year-old daughter, Emma, and her husband's father, Samuel, who was 70 years old and had the kind of lung trouble that winter did not forgive. 4 days earlier, their cabin had burned to the ground. Daniel had been on fire watch in the night. He had fallen asleep. The chimney had cracked in the cold, and a spark had gotten into the wall insulation, and by the time he woke, the roof was already gone. They had escaped with what they could carry. They had walked 2 days through the hills looking for shelter. They had found this cave by accident, following the same strange warm wind that Catherine had followed in July. Daniel had not spoken more than 10 words since the fire. He carried the rifle everywhere. He did not look his mother in the eye. He blamed himself for the fire, Sarah told Catherine later, and there was no consoling him because he was right to blame himself, and the only thing that could have made it better was for the fire not to have happened at all, and that was not a thing anyone could offer. They shared what they had that first night, Catherine's beans, Sarah's dried venison. Samuel coughed through most of the meal, and then as the fire warmed him through, he coughed less. He said it was the first time in weeks his chest had felt loose. Lily and Emma stared at each other across the fire with the wary fascination of children sizing up potential friends. That evening, when both girls were asleep and Daniel had gone outside to tend the horses, Sarah said very quietly, "There's something strange at the back of this cave." Catherine looked at her. Warm air, coming from deeper in. We didn't want to go look. Daniel said it might be bad air like mine gas, but it's been 4 days and we haven't smelled anything wrong. Catherine felt her heart quicken. Will you come look with me in the morning? Sarah nodded. In the morning. And so on the first morning of Catherine Morrison's life, inside that cave with the cart of her worldly possessions, parked just inside the entrance with her daughter asleep beside a girl she had met the night before with her husband, 3 weeks in the ground, and her mother's letter against her ribs, she took a candle and followed a stranger into the deeper dark of the hillside, looking for whatever was making the air warm. They walked for 40 paces. The passage narrowed. They had to turn sideways to squeeze through a crack where the rock pinched almost shut. And then the passage opened, and they stepped into a chamber that was larger than the first, with a ceiling that rose 10 feet above their heads. And in the middle of the chamber, running over dark stone in a series of low ledges, was a stream of water, water that steamed faintly in the candlelight. Sarah knelt down. She put her hand into the flow. She held it there for a long moment. Then she said in a voice Catherine would remember for the rest of her life, "Dear God in heaven, dear God." She did not say anything else for a long time. She just knelt there with her hand in the warm water, and after a minute, Catherine realized that Sarah Brennan was crying not loudly but silently, the way women cry, who have learned that loud crying is a luxury they cannot afford. Catherine knelt beside her. She put her own hand into the water. The warmth moved up through her fingers and into her wrist and into her arm, and she understood in that moment what the land had been trying to tell her in July, what she had tried to tell Thomas, what Thomas had laughed off as bears. This was not a trick of geology. This was not a passing thing. This was a gift the earth had been holding quietly for thousands of years, waiting for someone to be desperate enough to find it. The land does not lie, her mother had written. Only people lie. Catherine pulled the letter from her dress pocket. She did not open it. She just held it. She knelt beside Sarah in the warm dark of the inner chamber, and she held her mother's handwriting against her heart. And for the second time in 2 days, she cried. Sarah reached out and put her hand on Catherine's shoulder, and neither of them said anything. And the warm water ran quietly over the stones beside them. And in the first chamber, a boy with a rifle watched over two sleeping girls. And outside the cave, the snow began to come down harder. The two women decided that same afternoon to build a cabin inside the cave. It was Catherine's idea. She had lain awake most of the previous night, listening to Samuel's cough, watching the small fire struggle to heat even the first chamber properly, and she had thought about the warmth trapped in the inner room, inaccessible, without walls to hold it. The logic was simple. The warmth existed. The entrance let in cold. They needed the warmth, but also needed shelter from the wind that came howling through the cave mouth every few hours. A room inside a room. She told Sarah over morning coffee made from snowmelt, heated in a tin pot over the coals. Sarah listened without speaking until Catherine was finished, and then she looked toward the inner chamber where Daniel was tending to his grandfather. Daniel can build it. His father taught him. He's good with his hands. It might be the thing that gets him to speak again. They began that afternoon. Daniel went outside with an axe Catherine had brought on the cart. He cut young pines from the slope below the cave, each about 6 inches thick at the base. He dragged them one at a time up the draw and through the cave mouth and back through the narrow passage to the inner chamber. It took him 3 days to bring 15 logs in. He did it alone, refusing help, and by the end of the third day, he had eaten almost nothing and his hands were torn. When Sarah tried to bandage them, he finally spoke. "Ma, I'm sorry about the cabin." Sarah put down the bandage. She looked at him, at the blood on his palms, in the exhaustion in his face and the weight he had been carrying since the moment he woke to fire eating their roof. "I know, sweetheart, I know you are, but you didn't kill us. We're alive. Look around. We're alive and we have this." Daniel did not answer, but the next morning he let Catherine help him notch the logs, and he did not object when Emma brought them water. And when Samuel asked if he could sit nearby and offer advice on the joinery, Daniel said yes. The old man sat wrapped in blanket by the warm stream and told his grandson things he had learned from his own father 40 years before, and Daniel listened, and something in the boy's shoulders began to unclench for the first time since the fire. They built a cabin 12 feet by 15 feet with walls 5 feet high and a low sloping roof that fit just beneath the natural ceiling of the chamber. They mortared the gaps with mud brought in from outside before the ground froze solid. They positioned the cabin close enough to the warm stream that the wall on that side radiated heat steadily without the need for fire. They cut a small doorway with a hide flap, and inside they laid down straw ticking from the bedrolls. They put Samuel's bed closest to the warm wall, and Lily and Emma shared bedding in the opposite corner where the girls could whisper to each other at night. When the cabin was finished, after 10 days of work, Catherine stepped back and looked at it in the candlelight, and she understood that they had done something that no one in that valley, perhaps no one in that entire territory, had ever done. They had made a home inside the earth. The earth was keeping them warm. They had only needed to listen. 3 weeks after they moved into the inner chamber, Catherine found a bundle on a flat stone at the mouth of the draw. It was wrapped in flour sackcloth and tied with twine. Inside was a small pouch of salt, a glass bottle of cough syrup with a cork stopper, and a tight ball of thick wool yarn. No note, no name. Only the careful placement of the bundle on a stone that Catherine had been passing every day since November. She crouched beside it and studied the snow. The footprints were small, smaller than a man's boot. Someone had walked in, left the bundle, and turned back without continuing to the cave. The tracks went no further than the stone. She carried the bundle back to the inner chamber with the same cautious attention she would have given to a sound she could not identify in the dark. Someone knew where they were. Someone cared enough to leave supplies, but not enough to knock, or someone was afraid to be seen here. She did not know which possibility unsettled her more. A week later, on a cold morning when the snow had eased enough for Catherine to gather wood, she saw the woman at the stone. She was about 48, thin, wearing a coat patched in 3 places. She had a plain face and dark hair streaked with gray. When she saw Catherine coming up the draw, she froze with the instinct of someone caught in an act she had believed was secret. I know what it feels like when everyone tells you you're crazy. Her name was Winifred Crane. She was the seamstress at Dawson's Creek. 10 years earlier, her husband had died when his horse threw him against a fence post. According to the custom that still held in that corner of the territory, she was expected to marry her husband's younger brother, who was unmarried and in need of a wife. She had refused. From that day forward, she had been treated by most of the town as though she had broken some natural law. She took in laundry and sewing because it was the only work she could get. Margaret Walsh was her biggest customer, and that was why she had to leave the bundles at the stone instead of coming to the cave. If Margaret found out Winifred was helping the mad widow, Winifred would lose the work and she would not eat that winter. Catherine invited her inside. Winifred came. She stopped at the threshold of the inner chamber and felt the warmth and stood very still for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was not steady. "You aren't crazy at all. You're the most sensible woman in this entire territory." She stayed for the afternoon. She played with Lily and Emma. She held Samuel's hand while he coughed. She drank warm water from the stream cupped in her palms. And before she left, she told Catherine something that made Catherine's stomach drop. Reverend Isaiah Stone had arrived in Dawson's Creek. He had come with Margaret's letter. He was staying at the general store and he was assembling what he called a committee of concerned citizens. He intended, Winifred said, to ride up to the cave and assess whether Catherine Morrison's daughter was being raised in conditions fit for a Christian child. If he found the conditions unfit and he had the authority in that unregulated country to take Lily away and place her with a more suitable family. There was no court. There was no law that would stop him. There was only the Reverend's judgment and the opinion of the townspeople who supported him. Catherine listened without moving. When Winifred was finished, she said only, "Thank you. I won't tell anyone you came." Winifred left. Catherine sat by the warm stream for a long time, and she thought about Thomas, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about the letter in her pocket, and she thought about Lily playing with Emma in the cabin they had built together. She understood that she had two choices. She could wait for the Reverend to come to her and meet him on her own ground in her own home, where he would arrive already certain and she would be the one defending. Or she could go to him first into his ground and make him defend himself. She decided to go down the mountain. She left at dawn the next day. She took Daniel with her because he was 16 and tall and carried a rifle and because Sarah could watch Lily. They rode down to Dawson's Creek in silence, the snow crunching beneath the horses' hooves, and they arrived at Margaret Walsh's store at mid-morning, and Catherine tied her horse to the rail and walked inside. 8 people were in the store. Margaret stood behind the counter. Reverend Stone sat at a small table near the stove, drinking coffee. He was about 50 thin, in a black coat gone gray at the seams. He had the patient, certain expression of a man who had never doubted he was doing God's work. Catherine walked to the middle of the room. She was limping slightly because she had twisted her knee the week before carrying a log, though she would not mention this. Her clothes were clean but worn. Her hands were rough from work. She did not look like a woman who had come to beg. "Reverend Stone," he set down his coffee, "you have received a letter about my daughter, a letter from a woman who has never set foot in my home, a woman who wants my land for her brother." Margaret went white behind the counter. Her hand went to her throat. "You have not seen my child eat or sleep or breathe. You have not seen where she sleeps. You have not seen her warm by the water that runs through the rocks where we live. You are planning to take a child from her mother on the basis of a letter from a woman with a financial interest in my removal. If you want to judge my home, Reverend, come and see it. Come and kneel down and put your hand in the warm water and then tell me whether my child is in danger." The store was silent. The 2 men near the stove looked at their boots. Margaret's mouth was slightly open. The Reverend did not speak for a long moment. Finally, Margaret said in a voice that was smaller than she meant it to be, "This isn't about the land. This is about the child." "Then prove it. Come and see." Catherine turned and walked out. Daniel followed her. They mounted the horses and rode back up the draw without speaking, and when they reached the edge of the tree line where the cave was hidden, Daniel said, "Miss Catherine, you were like steel in there." "No, I was like a woman who has nothing left to lose." The Reverend did not come to the cave. 3 days later, he left Dawson's Creek without riding up the mountain, and the immediate threat lifted. But the longer threat had not left at all. 6 days after the confrontation at the store, Daniel came into the inner chamber with his rifle across his shoulder and a look on his face that Catherine had learned to read. "Miss Catherine," he said quietly so the girls would not hear, "there's been a man watching the cave mouth for 2 days. Same man. He don't come close. He just watches from the tree line on the far ridge." Catherine felt something cold move through her stomach. She set down the bread she was kneading. "Does he have a horse?" "Piebald, tied off a quarter-mile south in a stand of furs. I seen the tracks yesterday morning and followed them up to him this morning. I didn't let him see me." "Do you know who he is?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Clayton Walsh, Miss Margaret's brother. I seen him at the store last month when we was down. He was drunk then. He didn't see me." Catherine stood very still. She knew in the way a woman knows when a thing has shifted under her feet what Clayton Walsh was waiting for. He was not watching the cave out of curiosity. He was watching to see when Catherine left it. Where is he now? "Still on the ridge, been there since before sunrise." "Go get Henry." Daniel rode down the draw through the thin December afternoon and came back before dark with Henry Ashford beside him. The old hunter listened to Catherine without interrupting. When she was finished, he nodded once. "He's waiting for you to go down to the fin or for you to send the boy. Anyone leaves, he'll go down and burn the old place to the ground. Make it look like a chimney fire. Then your claim's no good for the winter. You'd have to sell. Miss Margaret's been saying for 2 months she'd buy it at a fair price to help you." "That isn't help." "No, ma'am, it is not. It is a snare dressed up in a bonnet." They set the trap that night. Henry and Daniel rode openly down the draw, making sure Clayton saw them going. They circled back on foot through the thick timber above the old cabin, arriving in the dark, and they waited in the loft above the main room with the door propped open as though no one were there. Clayton came just before dawn. He carried a tin of kerosene in one hand and a lit lantern in the other, and he was so drunk he was swaying as he walked. He stepped through the doorway of the cabin where Catherine had lived with Thomas for 4 years, and he set the lantern on the table, and he began to unscrew the cap of the kerosene tin. Henry dropped from the loft and pinned him to the floor with a knee on his chest before the kerosene cap came off. Daniel took the tin and the lantern. Clayton did not resist. He began to weep in the shapeless way drunks weep when they are caught, and he said over and over that his sister had told him to do it. His sister had promised him $50 and a piece of the claim. He said he had not wanted to do it. He said she had talked him into it across 3 long afternoons at the store, and he had not been strong enough to say no. Marshal Thaddeus Brooks rode up from Dawson's Creek the next morning and took Clayton Walsh away in irons. He would serve 2 years in the territorial jail. That night after the marshal had gone and Daniel had ridden back up to the cave to tell Sarah what had happened, Henry sat with Catherine on the porch of the old cabin that had almost burned. The two of them watched the sun go down behind the Absarokas, and Henry did not speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "I never told anyone this. I'm going to tell you." Catherine waited. "My sister's name was Adelaide. She was younger than me by 4 years. She married a man named Hiram Tolbert in the spring of 1848 in Pennsylvania before I come west. Hiram was a drinker. A mean man. I didn't like him the first time I met him, but she was 20 years old and I was her brother, not her father, and I did not say what I should have said." He paused. He drew a long breath. "She wrote me twice in the fall of 1849. I was out on a cattle drive in Missouri. The letters caught up with me 3 months late. She said she was afraid of him. She said he had started putting his hands around her throat at night, just to see her eyes. She asked me to come. I rode for Pennsylvania fast as a horse can go. I got there in November. There was nothing left of the cabin but ashes, and a sheriff who said it had been an accident. A lamp tipped over, he said. Hiram had been in town drinking when it happened. Everyone in that county knew what really happened, and no one would say it aloud because there was no proof. And Hiram was from an old family, and Adelaide was only a wife. Henry's voice did not shake, but his hands on his knees were white. I did not kill him. I wanted to. I rode up to his brother's house where he was staying, and I sat on my horse in the yard for 2 hours with my rifle across my lap, and I looked at him through the window, and then I turned the horse around and rode away. Because I knew if I killed him, I would be hanged, and my mother was still alive then, and I could not do that to her. So I let him live. He died of drink in 1853. I heard about it in a letter a year after it happened. I did not feel anything. I had already finished feeling things by then. He looked at Catherine. I have lived alone for 36 years, Miss Catherine. I told myself it was because I did not want the trouble of a wife. That was a lie. I lived alone because I did not come when my sister called me, and I did not think I deserved any woman's company after that. And then I rode up to your cabin in November, and I told you you were being foolish, and you were not being foolish. You were being the thing I should have been for Adelaide, and you are doing it for your daughter. And I could not sleep at night for a week after I left your place, because I thought, here is a woman who heard the danger and came for her child, and her neighbors are telling her to stop, and I am about to be one of those neighbors. He stopped. The sun was gone now. The first stars were coming out over the ridge. I am too old to fix what I broke with Adelaide, but I can help you, Miss Catherine, if you will let me. Catherine did not speak for a long moment. Then she reached out and she put her hand on the old man's shoulder. Come up to the cave tomorrow, Mr. Henry. Come up and meet the girls. Lily has been asking about you. Henry nodded. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. The next morning he rode up the draw, and Lily ran out of the cave to meet him, and he swung her up onto the saddle in front of him, and she laughed and he laughed too, for the first time that anyone could remember in a very long time. The storm came for them on January 3rd, 1886. It did not arrive the way ordinary storms arrived. It arrived the way a siege arrives, one cold front settling into the valley and refusing to move, and then another arriving behind it, stacking layering, so that by the second day the temperature had dropped to something the old men in Dawson's Creek would not describe in numbers, but in the places it found you. They said you felt it in the roots of your teeth. They said it settled into the bones of your hands through 3 layers of leather. The thermometer at the general store broke on the 4th day because the mercury contracted past the lowest mark and kept going, and the glass cracked, and no one replaced it because no one wanted to know. The folk memory of those parts would call it for decades afterward the week the sky fell. Inside the cave, Catherine watched it come. She watched it from the mouth where she stood, with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and her knees still aching when she put weight on it. The wind was already moaning in the rocks. The snow was falling so thickly she could not see the slope below, and she thought every cabin in this valley is about to learn what Thomas died, not knowing that the earth runs deeper than any fireplace can reach. That warmth is not something you make, but something you find. She went back into the inner chamber. Daniel was feeding the small fire in the cabin's iron stove, the one they had hauled in piece by piece in December. The cabin walls radiated the heat of the warm stream. Samuel was sitting up, breathing easily for the first time in months, reading aloud from a Bible to Emma and Lily. Winifred was there too. She had come up 4 days before, bringing thread and cloth and 3 loaves of bread, and the weather had closed in before she could go back, and none of them had suggested she leave. Sarah was kneading dough at the small table Daniel had built. She looked up when Catherine came in. Bad, bad. Sarah nodded slowly. Then we wait. 2 days into the storm, the knock came. It was not really a knock. It was a faint calling, almost lost in the wind, coming from the mouth of the cave. Daniel and Catherine went to look, carrying a candle between them. What they saw at the entrance made Catherine forget for one full breath that she was angry with anyone in that valley. James Hollister was on his knees in the snow at the threshold of the cave. His wife Anna was behind him, clutching a bundle against her chest. Their son Owen, 14 years old, the boy who had thrown a stone at Lily the previous November and called her a cave rat on the trail, stood behind his mother with his face white as paper. And the bundle in Anna's arms was their 20-month-old daughter Grace, whose breath was coming in small, crumpling paper sounds and whose lips were the wrong color. James looked up at Catherine. His face was frozen in patches. His eyes were wet in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. "Miss Catherine, please. The baby. She won't make it another night." James Hollister had been Thomas's friend at the mill. He had been at Thomas's funeral. 2 weeks after Thomas was buried, James had said to another man in the mill yard, loud enough for it to get back to Catherine, "His wife's gone a little soft in the head. Grief does that to women." Catherine had heard those words, and she had held them against him. And when he had passed her on the trail in December, she had not spoken. Now he was on his knees in her cave mouth, begging her to save his child. There was no pause in her. There was no moment where she considered it. The part of her that kept accounts of old wounds went quiet, and the part of her that had been a mother since the day Lily was born took over. "Bring her in, now. Anna, come with me. James, go with Daniel and bring warm water from the stream. Owen, close the hide flap behind us." And they came in. Anna Hollister crossed the threshold of the inner chamber and felt the heat rise through the layers of her frozen clothing, and her legs went out from under her. She sat down hard on the stone floor, still clutching the baby. Her whole body began to shake. She held Grace against her chest, and she looked up at Catherine and Sarah standing over her, and she began to cry. Not loud the way a woman cries when she has been holding herself together for 3 days, and her body has finally decided it cannot do it anymore. They worked on the baby for 2 hours. Sarah stripped the frozen outer clothes and wrapped the child in warm, dry cloth. Catherine boiled willow bark in water from the warm stream, added a pinch of dried mint from the stores, and fed Grace drops of it on her lips since the child was too weak to swallow. Winifred held the baby's small feet in her hands because Winifred knew that a baby's feet went cold first and came back last. Lily and Emma brought warm water from the stream in cups over and over so many times that by the end, they were walking asleep and Sarah had to send them to bed. At some point past midnight, Grace Hollister's breathing changed. The crumpled paper sound eased. The small chest rose and fell in a longer, deeper rhythm. Her lips, which had been blue, turned pink again. The fever that had been burning through her dropped enough that Catherine could touch the child's forehead without flinching. Anna felt the change under her hands before she saw it. She pressed her palm against the baby's ribs, and she made a sound that was not a word, a sound that rose from the deepest place inside her, the place where a mother keeps words she never knew she had. She looked at Catherine. "I owe you an apology before I owe you my thanks." 9 words. Catherine would remember those 9 words for the rest of her life because they contained something she had not known she needed until she heard it. Anna Hollister did not say the cave was warm, did not say the child was alive, did not say she was grateful. She said, "First, I was wrong." She said, "First, I know I was wrong." And she said it before she said anything else. Catherine did not know what to say back. She was not a woman who had prepared speeches. She reached down and she took Anna's hand and she held it and she nodded and Anna understood. And the baby slept between them. On the 4th day of the storm, Henry Ashford came. He came out of the white wall of the wind with his coat crusted in ice and his horse left somewhere below in the draw where it had found shelter against the rocks. He stood at the mouth of the cave, 66 years old, his beard white with frost. "My cabin's too cold, and I'm too old to die alone in winter." It was the first time in his life that Henry Ashford had said those words out loud to anyone. Catherine made room. The cave was not large, but it was large enough. Warmth, she had discovered, was not a resource that diminished when shared. That evening, Henry sat by the small stove in the inner cabin with Lily on his knee, and he told her stories. He told her about the first year he had ever hunted when he was 10 years old. He told her about a horse he had once owned named Gilbert, who could open a barn door with his nose. He told her about his sister Adelaide, whose name the children had never heard, though Catherine had heard it once on a porch in December, under a sky full of stars. He told Lily that Adelaide had loved lemon drops and had been afraid of cats and had once sewn a rag doll for a neighbor's baby that looked so much like the neighbor's husband that the whole family laughed until the baby cried. Lily listened with the solemn attention she gave to all important things. Is she gone too? Like my papa? Yes, darling. It's okay to talk about them, Mr. Henry. They like being remembered. Henry Ashford, who had not wept in front of another person in 40 years, put his face down against the top of the little girl's head, and his shoulders shrugged, and Catherine looked away to give him privacy. Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. Emma brought him a tin cup of warm water without being asked, and Henry drank it. And after a while, he looked up, and his face was changed. On the sixth day of the storm, Owen Hollister, who had not spoken a word to Lily since his family arrived, finally crossed the inner chamber and stood outside the small piece where the girls played. He stood there for nearly an hour, not going in, not leaving. Finally, Lily came out and looked at him. What do you want? Owen swallowed. What's this cave called? His voice was hoarse. Lily considered the question seriously. Then she said, the warm stone hall of the Cottonwood Queen. Mama named half of it. I named half of it. Owen nodded slowly. That's a good name. Those 4 words were the only apology he knew how to give. Lily accepted it the way a queen accepts tribute, with a small, gracious nod, and then she invited him inside to see where the warm water ran. Owen followed her, and he saw the stream, and he knelt down and put his hand in it. And when he pulled his hand back, he looked at it as though it belonged to someone else. James Hollister found Catherine alone that same evening, standing at the entrance to the inner chamber, looking into the main cavern beyond. Miss Catherine, she turned. Thomas told me once that his wife heard things other people couldn't hear. I laughed at him. I told him that was just a way of saying you were moody. He stopped. He swallowed. I didn't understand until tonight how proud he was of you when he said it. And I am sorry, Miss Catherine. I am truly sorry. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. He didn't always listen, but he brought us here. He brought us to the place where this was waiting. That has to be enough now. It has to be enough for me, and it has to be enough for you. James nodded and turned and went back to his wife and his children, and he did not speak of it again. But he did not need to. The storm broke on the 7th day. When the weather had cleared enough for travel, Winifred Crane rode down to Dawson's Creek with a message for Margaret Walsh. The message said, only this come see. 3 days later, Margaret came. She arrived at the mouth of the cave on horseback, wrapped in her best coat, her back rigid. Winifred was beside her. Margaret crossed the threshold and did not take another step for 7 full minutes. She stood just inside the entrance, feeling on her own skin the warmth she had described for 2 months as proof of madness. Her expression moved through several stages. Disbelief first, then confusion, then something that looked very much like grief, though Margaret Walsh would never have used that word about herself. Catherine did not speak. She did not offer anything. She simply stood in the passageway and waited. Margaret did not come into the inner chamber. She stopped at the mouth of the cave, and she turned to Winifred, and she said 2 words. I was wrong. She did not say them to Catherine. She said them to Winifred, the way some people can only confess their sins to someone other than the person they have wronged. But Catherine heard them, and she understood, and she did not need more than that. Margaret started to leave. She stopped at the threshold. She turned back, and this time she did look at Catherine. My daughter's name was Henrietta. She died in the winter of 1875. She was 12 years old. She had the same color eyes as your Lily. I did not want another child to die in a winter like that one. I know that does not excuse what I did. I know it does not excuse what I let Clayton do. That was my doing. I told him to do it. I told him where to go and when. The marshal has written it all down, and I will sign the paper tomorrow, because that is the least I can do. I want you to know I signed it. Then she turned and she went back down the mountain. Catherine never saw her again. Margaret Walsh closed her store within the month. She moved to a sister's house in the town of Bozeman, where she died 6 years later, alone with no one to attend her funeral. Clayton Walsh served his 2 years in the territorial jail. After his release, he left Montana and went south, and no one in Dawson's Creek ever heard from him again. And there it was, an ending that was not complete, a forgiveness that was not offered and not accepted. A woman who had hurt Catherine and whom Catherine would never see forgiven, and whom Catherine did not have to forgive in order to keep living. Some wounds close cleanly, some do not. Both kinds teach you something if you are willing to listen. The snow began to pull back from the low valleys in early March of 1886. The creek that ran past Catherine's old cabin began to move again, breaking through its ice cover in thin silver lines that widened day by day. The sky for the first time in months was blue. Catherine went down the draw with Daniel on a bright morning in the first week of March. Her knee had healed. She still limped slightly, and she would for the rest of her life, a small, deliberate gait that favored her left side. She walked down to the cabin where she had lived with Thomas for 4 years, and she and Daniel stood in the yard and looked at the roof. A section of the roof on the northwest corner had collapsed. Not just a small gap, a full collapse. Beams and shingles caved in under the accumulated weight of the snow, leaving a hole through which Catherine could see a drift of white piled nearly to the top of the interior walls. The corner that had collapsed was the corner where Lily's bed had been. Catherine stood very still. She did not cry. She did not say anything. Daniel stood beside her. He understood what he was looking at. He put a hand on her shoulder. "You saved her life, Miss Catherine. You heard the land." Catherine shook her head slowly. "My mother heard the land. I just did what she taught me." They walked back up the draw in silence. When Catherine got to the cave that had been her home for 4 months, she went straight into the inner chamber, and she found Lily playing with Emma on the floor of the small cabin, and she picked her daughter up, and she held her for a long time without speaking. Lily allowed it with the patience of a child who had decided her mother needed the holding more than she did. That spring they left the cave. They did not leave it forever. Catherine rebuilt the cabin on her claim with Daniel and Henry and James Hollister helping her. The three of them worked through April and into May, and when it was finished, the new cabin had a proper steep roof that could shed snow and walls built tight against the wind, and a root cellar dug deep into the hillside because Catherine had learned now about what the earth holds and what it does not. Sarah Brennan built her own cabin on the adjoining claim. The two widows raised their children side by side for the next 15 years. They quarreled sometimes. They were not perfect. Sarah thought Catherine pushed the children too hard. Catherine thought Sarah did not push them enough. They remained friends and something like sisters, and Lily and Emma grew up together and remained close all their lives. Daniel Brennan became a fine carpenter. He married a school teacher from Bozeman named Beatrice when he was 24. He never fully forgave himself for the fire that had driven his family to the cave. He carried that guilt the rest of his days. But he raised 3 children of his own in a house he built with his own hands, and he never fell asleep on fire watch again. Not once. Emma Brennan became a midwife. She learned the trade from Sarah, who had learned it from her own mother, and she said for the rest of her life that she also learned it from Catherine Morrison, who had taught her to kneel down and listen to what the land was saying about the body. Emma delivered more than 400 babies in her career. She did not lose a single mother to childbirth fever. She was buried in 1957 at the age of 80 by 3 generations of the family she had served. Samuel Brennan lived through the spring and into the summer and died peacefully in his sleep in August of 1886 in a rocking chair on the porch of the cabin Sarah was building.